Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Craig Jeffery. I'm here with another senior advisor from Strategic Treasurer, Paul Galloway. We are discussing Treasury Roles and Development. This is part two of a likely four-part series. And just by way of background, operational effectiveness and strategic excellence are two key components for the Treasury role. And this short series explores some of the different types of roles within Treasury. We began with an overview of the three roles. They were strategic, operational, and hybrid. This is the second session, and we're going to be looking at the strategic role. We'll call this Mastering the Strategic Role. We invite you to provide any feedback you have or ideas for managing the different roles in Treasury. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Thanks, Craig. Good to be here.
Yeah, I know as we're talking about how Treasury professionals have different areas of emphasis or different roles, we're on to the topic of strategic as opposed to operational or a hybrid role being between strategic and operational. Maybe you can start the conversation by explaining some ways in which the strategic role differs from the operational role.
Yeah, Craig, when I think about the operational role, I think of treasurers in a normal or not a normal capacity, but what used to be considered a normal capacity. It's kind of the day-to-day blocking and tackling. And treasurers spend a lot of time focused on that, making sure that operationally cash was getting moved where it needed to be, that the company had access to cash when it needed it, or capital for its balance sheet, that it did the things that the organization needed from banking relationships to reporting. So it was very functional in nature. Still is today. The operational role hasn't gone away. You still need that. But what they're doing today is they're leveraging systems and other functionality within the organization or outside the organization to become more efficient. And what this has done is it's allowed treasurers to start focusing on the strategic aspects of their role, which is relatively new. Not entirely new, but relatively new. And it allows a treasurer to step back and say, okay, from an organizational standpoint, how can the treasury function across the entire platform be able to provide access to cash or capital for the organization to grow? So it's beyond just day-to-day functioning. It becomes more of a strategic conversation. And so they're talking with not only the CFO, but they're talking to business unit leaders that may need access to cash or capital down the road for very strategic initiatives. So these require more thought, more analysis, more internal partnering to come up with potential pros and cons to an approach, or to be able to support the business unit or the business writ large to meet these more strategic initiatives that may be driven from the CEO down or the business unit leaders.
You made a number of good points. It seems like you were indicating that for many treasury groups, they've become more strategic of late, looking at relationships, a longer term view. And I think that's true. And, on the whole, there's certainly been a number of treasury groups and teams that have been looking at these strategic activities, the balance sheet out many, many years, financing, understanding risks for a long time. And that may differ by industry, company position. So things like non-bank financial institutions, companies like insurance companies, or those that are very heavy in that area often have had groups or multiple people who do that. When we look at some smaller organizations, oftentimes the treasurer's in a hybrid role. They're having to do multiple items. They get a person who can do cash positioning, or they get a treasury manager who can handle operations and perhaps some of the hybrid activities, and they can focus more on the top of the house. So those are Those are some of the things that we've seen happening for a long time, and then a additional focus on making sure organizations are planning for the long term. So, Paul, as we look at what type of perspective is necessary for both senior treasury as well as management when executive management looks at treasury as a department, what should they be looking for? What should they be hoping to evidence in terms of their roles? I'll start with a couple thoughts, Paul. Maybe you could fill this in. I think they are looking, management, leading treasurers are looking for people in a group that has at least somebody looking far ahead and someone looking sideways. And what I mean by that is when someone looks ahead, they're looking at particularly, what does the balance sheet need to look like? What are the risks that the organization faces further down the road? How can I make sure that the balance sheet in particular supports the overall goals of the organization, the mission, whether it's growing in certain areas or shifting to different geographies or picking up new lines of business, that they should be looking far and helping the organization anticipate farther than, the next 30 days, not just, let's say, short-term cash position, but looking further afield. And then on the looking sideways, Paul, this is the, risk orientation. What can come at the organization from the side, whether it's liquidity risk, interest rate risk, some type of financial risk or other element that maybe others in the organization aren't considering. Treasury needs to have people who are, I don't want to say paranoid, but very risk oriented. They walk into a room and they have a risk manager view. They look at what can go wrong. How do I mitigate that risk? How can I accept the risks that are fine? And how do I address those? So those are a couple things that I'll start out with. I'd love to hear what you think, some of your thoughts on the right types of perspectives to have.
Treasurers today are taking longer views on a lot of different things. Several areas that I can think of would be, forecasting. Forecasting is going out longer so that they can understand cash needs and demands. But on top of that, it also is including this component of, capital needs. So think about treasurers having ownership in the capital management of the organization. So it's not just cash, it's capital. So that takes a little bit longer view perspective. And so then they've got relationships with rating agencies and banks, to help support this capital management view. And so when you start taking those longer views on things, then risk becomes more important. And so you do have to, as a treasurer, you do have to walk into the room with this thought process or this idea that, hey, I want to make sure that I understand what risks matter, what things can impact the organization in a negative way or in a positive way, and how do I mitigate the risks that could be a negative impact to the organization. And there is a certain point where, you're not going to manage away all the risks. There's a certain amount of risk that every organization is willing to accept. It's just a matter of what are the right belts and suspenders to put in place to make sure that you've mitigated as much as possible and put the organization in a position that, given what you know today and what you expect to happen, that there won't be adverse impacts that would stymie the organization for continuing to do what it does.
When you said adverse impacts, this is of size or magnitude that would be deleterious or very damaging to an organization, taking it outside its risk, not just its risk capacity, but maybe its tolerance for risk, which causes maybe overly protective activities after that if they suffer a loss that's more than they're comfortable with.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Certainly got to look at what are the activities internally, externally, what could the impacts be, what are the magnitudes. Certainly magnitudes can make a difference. There are probably scenarios where you may have something that's in the infancy, and while the magnitude might not be significant, there could be a risk that could impact something that is you're working on to bring out to market that's a brand new product or service. And so you try to, manage those kinds of risks when you got something that's maybe very young or new to the market.
I want to talk about the strategic role and its view of other roles. We've been maintaining that there's different perspectives, operational excellence, a strategic view, hybrid views where certain roles and functions may require someone to wear both those types of hats or take two types of postures. How do we think about respecting the other roles if, let's say, we are in a strategic role, we're working on the debt and capital markets? How should we properly think about those other types of roles? And maybe you can explain that just generally, or perhaps as you took on a role, stood up a Treasury Department of a fairly significant company and had to build the department and move from, had to do both all the time to bringing on a team that does that, both those types of functions.
That was a great learning experience for me. I had a lot of experience from different organizations that lend itself to doing what I did at this particular company. And there was a great need for a Treasury Department, but there weren't people in place. It just wasn't something that existed. So I had to build it from scratch. So not only was it processes and systems, but it was people as well. And so my role went from building something out, creating something, to working on the operational, day-to-day operational aspects to the strategic aspects. So I'd find myself in the mornings, I spent a lot of time with my team working on cash positioning, forecasting, ensuring that we had liquidity sources available, and talking internally with my business unit leaders, talking with banks, and just ensuring that from an operational standpoint, everything flowed smoothly. I spent a lot of time just really intense, really fast paced, and that was my morning. Coffee helped me through that, thank goodness. By the afternoon, I had to switch roles, switch hats, because I had responsibility for rating agencies, bank relationships, capital funding. I had to raise capital. I had to put in place liquidity sources like Federal Home Loan Bank, give considerations to internal or intercompany loans or in-house banking. So I had to spend time on some of these more strategic aspects that took time. It's not easy to make that switch. And so people outside of Treasury might not fully appreciate, what is Paul doing? I can see he's doing some of this stuff in the morning. By the afternoons, I don't know if he's doing anything at all. I was spending a lot of time on all kinds of different projects. Some of it was quite labor intensive and took a lot of brain power and relationship building to get some of these things across the finish line. What about you? You've got experience doing the same thing. What kinds of things or challenges have you seen, in respecting the two different roles and capacities?
When I moved into Treasury, I had moved from a area of finance. I moved into a management role, so I had supervisors and various team members, a fairly large team to be responsible for. So my role was a bit hybrid. I would be approving things or overseeing activities or filling in one manager's route. But I was also responsible to help automate and figure out what needed to be done to make the area more efficient, especially as responsibilities grew, more people got added. There were a number of, let's just say, a reduction in force that took place. So one of the things that was important for me as we're going through that was to take on some of those daily roles, the operational roles, to really understand what was going on. It's one thing to get a concept going. It's another thing to do it for a few days. And I found I was much better at helping to automate processes when I did the work for a few days. I didn't have to do it for a week, but doing it for a few days, there was a bunch of items and activity that taught me not only what the work was, but how it made you feel. And when I say how it made you feel is, I remember I picked up the cash positioning activity and we needed to automate it. That was being split out from, I'll just call it one of the companies, and it was coming over to ours. So our team had to pick it up. Going and sitting down with Bob for a few days to see how the process worked. And I just remember thinking, this is some type of organized chaos, dozens of phone calls. It's dozens of emails, reports being dropped off physically, reports being sent, communicating with traders to make investments. There's just like a million individual activities to get things organized. There was two things. One, it was we need to automate some of these pieces to get the data coming in digitally. So we're only reviewing, not having a million touch points. But it also set up this idea, like you were talking about in the afternoon, you worked on projects. In the morning, you were putting out the fires or working the daily process. And I just remember how, I don't want to say jacked up, but how when there's so many millions of items there, you get this like hyper mentality. And then in the afternoon, you're spun up. And so it's like, how do you sit there and think deeply when you're spun up? And so lunch would oftentimes act as a natural break to try to calm down and then say, let's think about how we do these things on a more long-term basis. And so that was very instructive to my thinking about these two different roles. It was helpful for how we had to automate things. But I just remember it was hard to shift. It was kind of like you're grinding the gears. It's hard to press the clutch in, shift the stick into the right lever, and move the gas pedal and the clutch at the right way to make things transition smoothly. There was a bit of grinding of the gears, and so that was some aspect of it. But the other thing, Paul, too, and it seems like certain people are really good at operational excellence and lots of activities. They thrive on it and do really well with a million things thrown at them at once. And others, that would drive them crazy. And others they need to think long, deeply on certain topics, be very careful in their analysis. And some of those people aren't very good at the myriad of activities that come on the operational side, Paul.
Sometimes I saw some of that myself, trying to transition between the two roles. Would I say I thrive on the fast-paced environment? Not necessarily, but I certainly can live within it. I've proven it and done it. My preference is more of the strategic, but I did find out I was able to do both. It's just really, to your point, it's difficult to move from one set of activities to another because it requires different pace, different perspective, different focus. And the nature of what's being done is they're almost polar opposites. It's like you got a barbell and you're on one end in the morning, you're on the other end in the afternoon. Not everyone is able to deal with that. So some people could come into a treasurer role that requires more of the hybrid approach and do just fine. And others, they would rather, find an organization that is just purely strategic or purely operational.
It's ping pong in the morning, lots of motions without moving a lot of weight. They're like individual. The weight adds up by the sheer number of paddle swings that you have. And then in the afternoon, you're lifting weights, a lot less reps, but very, very different. So it's just, strength versus speed looks very different. Maybe we could talk about transitioning between different roles or as you take on more strategic activities. One thing that was, I would say was interesting for me was there were so many activities. We were always bringing on new business. And so it was design and lay out how the process should work. That was something we had to do all the time. Build new, here's a new process, how it flows to the banks, how the accounting worked, making sure that that's communicated and documented. And so that became very regular, what was being done. But I remember one transition, there was this, reviewing large contracts with banks or technology firms. I remember that was something I put off because you had to sit down and go through things in detail. I remember putting some of those things off and putting them off and putting them off. I remember I remember the treasurer saying, "When are you going to get this done? You need to get this done," because the banker had asked about it. And so I I made sure I sat down and got all of it done and went through it. And I'll tell you, after that, as I've gone through more and more contracts, I mean, I've gone through, in my role, I've gone through, I don't know how many. I mean, it's thousands and thousands of contracts. I mean, every week there's multiple agreements and contracts to go through. To me, that's almost like the operational, like we just fly through them. And I just remember how hard it was to do that type of review. Not that reviewing contracts is always strategic, but I just remember those transitions are sometimes hard. You get out of your comfort zone, and a weakness can become a strength.
I can relate to that, Craig. In a prior role where I worked in corporate development and we did M&A transactions and capital funding, I spent a lot of time looking at agreements. So it was either agreements on the deals we were doing, or it was agreements through due diligence. And so I spent a lot of time with lawyers and bankers and various businesses, and I really cut my teeth learning how to understand and go through legal documents. Yeah, that served me well in my role at the prior company where I built out the Treasury department, because I spent a lot of time reviewing agreements there, both for capital funding and for the systems that we put in place. A lot of different agreements that I went through. The more you go through them, the better you get at it, right? I mean, you gain speed because you understand the things that matter, the things that are traditional boilerplate language that you expect to see in there, which you want to make sure it's in there. And then you can identify where the gaps are, whether, legally there's some things that you may want to have in there that aren't in there, or some things that are in there that, aren't favorable to you. And so you want to get rid of them. So there's always that kind of legal cat and mouse game that you play, where you might give up something to get something, or you get something by giving up something.
Yeah. And thinking about risk, reviewing contracts, not from a legal standpoint as much from a business standpoint, the risk factors in there greatly. The last section for our discussion today about mastering the strategic role, I think we'll probably do this in each section, but we can see if that really works as we go through this. But what is the opportunity or the threat here for automation for the strategic role? What do you think about that? What are some of your thoughts there?
So it could be said that by automating some things that maybe folks are a little less intimate with the detail, because the details just coming and getting fed into whatever system, and then a report is generated and you're taking the report and making decisions off the report. So you might think of, the analogy of understanding the nuts and bolts. Perhaps some of that, you lose some of that through automation. The flip side is that the efficiency gains that you get can be significant and can save a lot of time and can help decision makers cut through information that would perhaps slow them down in the decision process. There's opportunity there with the automation, and this opportunity presents itself with efficiency gains, better reporting, more timely reporting, more actionable activity through automation. So I think there's definitely benefits there to it. One of the things that is key, though, and where the nuts and bolts come into play, is the data. You have to understand the data in order to automate, meaning you got to understand what is it you need. So you do got to go back to the nuts and bolts to get to a point that you have a source of truth and you have the moving parts that matter that go into your automation. So if you have lack of data or you have incomplete data, you have parts of something but not everything, the automation doesn't really mean anything at that point, because whatever gets put into a report or some other tool within the system to generate decision making, you'll make it with incomplete or missing information.
You were talking about data and some automation. I had no idea what you were going to say on this section we talked about here for the threat or the opportunity. And I guess it spurred me to think in a couple different areas, hearing your responses. When I think about, in a strategic role, there might be two different areas to to focus on automation. One is on this risk orientation. How do we effectively understand our risk, understand what our exposures are? And one of the biggest challenges here is getting at all of the data, making sure all the data is accurate. And I think now in 2022, there is much better opportunities for understanding foreign exchange exposures in your company, other external exposures, commodity price, other elements, financial risks that exist. I think we have better tools for pulling that information together. And then I think the opportunity and threat is if we pull it together, we have to make sure it's pulled together and it's accurate. And part of that is becoming more of a technology expert or having that in your group so that you can do this quickly. Because modeling risks, if they're long-term existing known risks, you can have systems and processes where the data flows in, it runs the models for you, and you act on it. But oftentimes Treasury is looking ahead, things are changing, and so that requires building new bridges to the future. It's not building to the past. And so I think that's an area that is an opportunity for Treasury professionals to make sure we know where the data is that we can get. We know what the limitations are. We pull that together. We might use more business intelligence tools, more Excel modeling than something that's incorporated into a financial risk system, into a Treasury system, because we're modeling something that maybe is new, a combination of things haven't occurred before, or maybe it is something that's built and we're making sure it's factored in. That seems to be one area that I think about, I know we've talked about as we work with companies to make sure you understand all of your exposures properly, quickly, and accurately. You know, I think you talked about efficiency, and I think there's an element of that for when we think about the strategic role, understanding where things are in the future. And you run models, you look at what your balance sheet needs to be like. And that's true. You want that to be fairly efficient. But there's also a strategic aspect of what do you do with your technology to help the operational and the strategic, but certainly the operational. And that involves understanding tech to say, what do we do with data, with our connections over time, with our systems, and then reporting and analytics as a way of monitoring what goes on. If we're undergoing change, and I think there's more change on the operational side, if it's less automated operational activities, a larger percentage of that activity can be automated. At least it seems that way to me. And by pulling that into systems, we need to think about how do we do that so that it supports not only today's needs, but over time. And so we make decisions on formats, on connections. Are we using file-based connections, APIs, or streaming? Are we anticipating being able to do all our analysis in one system or another? We're going to do it free-form in Excel, or are we also going to layer in business intelligence tools? How will that factor in with where we put data and information, in a data lake, for example, and we will pull that data into our analysis tool because we're running a lot of analysis as an analytical group. So a couple of those things you said made me think about those other aspects of strategy around automation, for efficiency and for analytics and modeling.
Yeah, spot on. I mean, organizations today are understanding that data management has become more and more important. And you're finding organizations that are hiring tech-savvy people to manage data. And these can be everything from a data scientist to IT folks to understand how to manage a data lake to get information in, to ensure that it's source of truth, good information, working with business units that drive the data going into there, and then as well as making connections into systems. And so data management is extremely important for organizations today. And I think if people, younger people aren't understanding that today, they need to get up to speed on that, because more and more companies are going to demand that people understand how to manage data, but also the analytics behind understanding data and what it's telling us.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for talking on the strategic role today as part of this series. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Craig.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.